Shaheen, let me know when we're good. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today. My name is Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, broadly helping people understand what's going on around the world and what's going on with these money. Anyway, there we go. So thank you so much for joining us. I'll keep our part pretty short. I know we only have about 45 minutes with the Senator, which we're so grateful she opened up her time for this important discussion here today on the results of the NATO summit, where things go from here, and why it remains so important. Quickly mention nonpartisan, nonprofit. We don't take stances on policies or positions on candidates, et cetera, all that fun stuff. And we are a community-supported organization, so thank you to all of the members, donors, and sponsors who have made our work possible and helped us grow this organization over the past 70 years. Not quite as old as NATO, but we're getting there. So I'm gonna quickly turn it over to the interim president, vice chancellor. Yes, it's a lot. Yeah, that doesn't fit on one business card. But Chuck, would you like to say a few words? Thank you so much for opening up your space for today's event.
Of course. Thank you so much. It is a long title, and it's fun to play new guy. This is my first week on the job. Senator, great to see you. Interim president here at Manchester Community College. Thanks for being here. We are also nonpartisan and welcome everyone in. One of the things I like to always tell people is we are about access, about affordability, and about students. And Senator, I know that's near and dear to your heart, so it's great to have you here. I would also like to just remind folks, we have students from over 50 countries right here at Manchester Community College. So as we talk about civic engagement and community and coming together in this exchange we're about to listen to, just thinking about our students and where they fit into this bigger picture is really near and dear to our hearts. So this is not about us. I want to hear the exchange, and Senator, just welcome back. Tim, thanks for organizing. And I don't get to thank your staff enough, so while I have the microphone, I want to thank your staff for all the great work they do to organize all of this. So with that, welcome to Manchester Community College, and I look forward to the exchange.
All right. Well, thank you again to everyone for joining us for this important conversation. As I'm sure you all know, the Senator has a few important roles when it comes to foreign policy. She's a senior member of the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee in the U.S. Senate. She is also a co-chair and co-restarter, I guess we'll call it, of the Senate NATO Observer Group since 2018 with Senator Thom Tillis. So really cannot have a better person here today to talk to us about NATO, about the summit. I know you were there for the whole thing and spoke a couple times, met with many of the international foreign leaders and dignitaries. So why don't we just turn it over to you and get a few insights on what you saw, what you heard, and what people should know most about the NATO summit over the past couple days.
Okay, great. I think this will work, but I also think when I turn this on, it messes up your mic.
Okay.
So
we'll switch mics.
yes, we may need to change the sound system here. But let me first thank all of you for coming this morning. Thank you to Tim and the World Affairs Council for hosting us, and to Manchester Community College and Chuck, thank you for the role you're playing both here and at the community college system as Vice Chancellor. So really appreciate it. And you talked about reminding students about why this is important. One of the things we were excited to do as part of the NATO Summit this week was to get 4 New Hampshire students from different colleges into the summit to be able to observe, and they were very enthusiastic. So next year we should have somebody from the community college. So I thought it was a very good week for NATO. It celebrated its 75th anniversary, and we went into the NATO summit. Thom Tillis and I had the opportunity to talk to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg a couple of weeks before the summit about what he wanted to accomplish. And he gave us basically 3 goals. He said first is defense and deterrence. So one of the things that was announced this week is that of the 32 NATO member nations, 23 have reached the 2% of GDP spent on defense, which is a significant improvement from where we were a few years ago. The second piece was to support Ukraine and to reassure Ukraine that the support from NATO is there. And I think in that respect, the summit was also very successful. What we saw and what we heard, the rhetoric was NATO has an irreversible commitment to Ukraine to, at the end of the conflict with Russia, to join NATO. And there were also a number of weapons and systems announced to continue to support Ukraine in this war. One, you may have heard President Biden announce that we will be providing 5 more missile defense systems for the country, Patriots, and as we think about the horrific attack on the Children's Hospital in Kyiv earlier this week, which was, you could see that it was done deliberately by Russia to send a message at the start of the summit in a way that is just so horrific. But those missile defense systems would help protect Kyiv and other cities in Ukraine. And then, of course, a number of other nations announced additional planes, F-16s, for the Ukrainians as they're thinking about how to address the whole defense aspect of this war. Those are very important. And we saw an announcement of an additional support group called the Wiesbaden Group that will be working out of Germany and talking about a NATO office in Ukraine as well. So I think a lot of deliverables for Ukraine that were very important. We also signed a mutual security agreement between the United States and Ukraine, as it did a number of other countries, in ways that are trying to bridge the period from now until when Ukraine can actually become a NATO member. The third aspect, the third goal for the summit was to continue to focus on the Indo-Pacific nations that have been participating in the last 3. This was the 3rd NATO summit that included New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and Japan. And I thought the statement coming out talking about China's enabling of Russia in Ukraine was clearly the strongest statement that has been made by NATO about what China is doing. And I think the role that they're playing in the Indo-Pacific and the concern that the 4 IP countries who have been part of the NATO summit have about China's role. This has to be reassuring that there are a lot of countries in Europe now that have recognized the threat that China poses. I had a chance to visit the Indo-Pacific back in March, and we went to the Philippines, Vietnam, the Republic of Korea, and Japan. And what we heard, I was surprised that what we heard from all the leaders we met with was a question about how we're supporting Ukraine in this war and how important that is, and they're watching very carefully the outcome because they understand that what's happening in Ukraine and the willingness of the NATO allies and the United States to stay committed to that effort is important, not just to our future security, but to what's happening with our adversaries. So our allies are watching it and our adversaries, and they saw a direct connection between what she does in China with Taiwan and what happens with Ukraine and Russia's involvement in the Ukraine war. So I think on all 3 of those fronts, the summit this week was a big success. I would add a 4th to that, and some of you may know I co-sponsored legislation in the United States called the Women, Peace, and Security Act, which recognizes the role that women play in conflict areas and the important role of women's inclusion in those conflict areas. And as we look at the number of women in Ukraine who are participating both actively in the military and in so many other roles as the result of this war, it's important to see that agenda continue to be supported. And so the NATO summit approved a plan for fully integrating women, peace, and security into NATO. they've been working on this for a number of years, and this was another step forward. So I was excited about that. As I said, I sponsored that legislation that made the United States the first and so far only country that has legislatively approved a women, peace, and security agenda as part of our foreign policy. So I thought, again, it was a big success, and obviously we have a lot to do, but it also showcased Sweden and Finland, their first summit since they've become members, and they add tremendous capability and knowledge to NATO. So, thank you.
Yeah, well, that certainly is quite a lot for just a couple of days. I know this, the planning and the work continues on well in advance and well after. Some of the things that you mentioned that I think are important to really highlight are the increases of NATO countries who are reaching that 2%. Canada just last night, I think, finally put a date on when they'll get there.
Yes,
we'll see
finally.
if that happens. You know, after their military said we're in shambles, 40% of our fleet is unusable. But this is, of course, one of the things that is most controversial or most talked about when we talk about NATO is burden sharing. This has been a problem since Eisenhower, and maybe even since before they even came up with the idea of NATO. We have seen movements forward, but what is the balance? What is the reason that we want to continue to have this alliance, even if people aren't meeting those goals? Even if people aren't there yet and just are still working to it, and there are questions as to whether they even get there. Why should America secure Europe in a way that many people claim we're doing right now?
Well, first of all, I think it is important to point out how that commitment works for NATO. I think there is some thinking that, well, it's countries contribute directly to NATO. That's not what the 2% means. It's 2% of each country's gross domestic product spent in the country on defense, because the assumption is that if every country is better able to defend itself, then NATO as a whole is able to defend itself. And part of the ongoing effort is also about interoperability for weapon systems and efforts that are happening in countries. And we're actually, as you point out, Canada announced a plan. Canada has been sad to say, because Canada's our neighbor and one of our strongest trading partners and one of our best allies, and they've really been laggards on their commitment to getting to the 2% of GDP. So I think Prime Minister Trudeau heard loudly and clearly from a number of us in the Senate that, and from NATO, that they needed to do better. So hopefully we will see them do better and watch very closely. We also have a number of countries that are actually over the 2% of GDP, in addition to the United States. Poland, Estonia are actually spending more of their GDP on defense than the United States. So we want to remind people that this is a floor, not a ceiling. And it's important because as we think about the challenges that we face here in the United States, you know, we've been protected since our beginnings by having two oceans that have protected us from Europe and from Asia. But what we learned in World War I and II is that that really didn't protect us. That while we were able to avoid the war for some time, it wound up touching us very directly. And that's the concern about what happens with Russia and Ukraine. I can tell you from talking very directly to a number of the European leaders who feel most threatened by Russia, that they are totally convinced that if he's successful in Ukraine, he's not going to stop with Ukraine. And of course, what happens in Ukraine, as I said earlier, sends a message to our adversaries, to Iran, to North Korea, to China. And what we've seen in the last months is a growing I don't want to call it a partnership, but a growing relationship between those four countries and their willingness to take on the West and democracies. And so as we think about the threat that we could be facing, it doesn't stop with the war in Ukraine, and it doesn't stop with NATO. NATO is in our interest, and as I said to some folks at one of our defense companies a couple of months ago, if we don't stop Putin, if we don't send a clear message to the dictators who are a threat to democracies around the world, that we're going to be united, that we're going to stand with our allies and do what we promised, then they are enabled to do what they want to do with other countries, and that ultimately is going to touch the United States. And I have 4 grandsons. I don't want to see my grandsons go to war in Europe. So there's a very direct correlation between ensuring that our defense can help us deter those threats, and that's why the 2% is so important.
And one thing that I've been thinking about, but haven't heard much discussion around, and I'd love to hear your insights, because this is the best part of my job, is I get to ask the questions I want to ask. Isn't it just beneficial, even if they aren't reaching their 2%, to have them? I mean, Canada was with us in Afghanistan, 40,000 troops over 12 years. They were spending 1.4%, and they're working to increase that. But many of the people who say NATO is obsolete or we don't want to be in NATO, it's not like Canada's a big liability in terms of, you know, dragging us into a war. Same with many of the other countries in NATO. So isn't it just better to have them doing something? We don't have to then spend the $5.6 billion that Canada spent on those troops in Afghanistan. It seems to me that that is a net benefit regardless if they're reaching their 2%. Of course, we want people to get there, but isn't it better to have these friends and allies than not?
Absolutely. And one of the real advantages the United States has in our foreign policy over some of our adversaries is that we do have those allies. And we have Article 5 in NATO that says an attack on one is an attack on all, and that we are going to come to the defense of whoever is attacked. And as we know, the only time that has been invoked was when the United States was attacked on 9/11. So it makes a huge difference. And there are disagreements sometimes within NATO, but the importance is to continue to be together, continue to be unified, and to send that message. And as I said, we really benefit from the addition of Sweden and Finland as well.
Well, that's a nice segue into another question. We have seen some disagreements within NATO. I'm looking at Hungary, I'm looking at Turkey, and we explored this in a recent podcast with Daniel Coaches of the Hudson Institute. What can we do? Should we be concerned about some of the adventurism, we'll call it, that's going on, or challenging? We also did a podcast on Turkey called Turkey Strategic Partner, Strategic Headache, and it probably lands somewhere in between, but we see Orban doing things that are not in our collective interest. We see Turkey slow playing the entrance of Finland and Sweden. Can you talk a little bit about the potential for unity, the potential for disunity, and what we can do to continue to keep this alliance together and keep it strong?
Well, look, I was not happy to see the picture of Viktor Orban and Donald Trump smiling from Mar-a-Lago after he had just been to see Vladimir Putin and Xi from the PRC. So I think that is not helpful. Obviously, NATO has to decide how to deal with countries that may not be acting in the best interest of the alliance. And of all countries, Hungary should understand the threat that Russia and Putin poses. Having been invaded by Russia, having been part of the Soviet orbit, and understanding the restrictions to freedom and the challenges in the Soviet Union, but also having been invaded in the 50s. So it's disappointing, really, to see that. And I was in Hungary back in February. And I can tell you that we heard from civil society groups in Hungary who are very concerned about the crackdown on civil liberties in the country, the crackdown on the media. And so I think that is a huge challenge. My co-chair, Thom Tillis, has a great way of describing some of the disagreements in NATO. He says, I come from a family of 6 kids. He said, one of my sisters, I'm sure would never vote for me if she lived in North Carolina. But if the family's safety and security is threatened, we all come together. And so there have been periods throughout NATO's history where NATO members have not always been on board with all of the policies of NATO. It's a consensus organization, and so that presents a challenge. But I think we are better off having them in NATO than out of NATO. And Turkey has the 2nd largest army in Europe. They have, and I had a chance to visit Turkey on that same trip that we went to Hungary, and we had a very good meeting with President Erdogan and talked about the opportunity to think about more ways that we can cooperate in the future. And so I think there are some real opportunities for a breakthrough in some areas around the F-35, the S-400. Turkey got F-16s as part of their final agreement to allow Sweden into NATO. And so I think we have a real chance now to address some of what have been ongoing challenges with Turkey.
Yeah, and just for anyone who isn't aware, the S-400 is a Russian missile defense system that Turkey purchased, causing big headaches for NATO. They have not deployed it, they've tested it, and it's kind of on the shelf right now. So
that's right. And as a result, they were not allowed to participate in the F-35, the next generation aircraft that a number of European countries and the United States have.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll ask one more question. You may have seen me checking my phone. I am looking for emails from our online audience. So if you do have a question, please do send those in. I am not checking, sports scores or anything like that. I like to make that clear for anyone watching today. But you mentioned your 4th area of interest for NATO being women, peace, and security. You spoke on a panel at NATO. Can you talk a little bit more about the legislation you proposed and got passed, as well as what NATO's commitment will be moving forward in that realm? And then for those in the audience, we'll come to you next with questions. So be thinking. We have a microphone for you as well. So yeah, I'll turn it to you first.
Okay. Well, our legislation was based on, or comes out of a UN Security Council resolution that was passed in 2000 that said we need to involve women. And some really good data that shows that when women are at the table in conflict negotiations, that those negotiated settlements are 35% more likely to last 15 years or longer. So there's real data that shows when women are involved, we know this, that societies that empower women tend to be more stable, more freedoms, more democratic. Women contribute more to families, communities, and countries in much of the world, and more than men, I should say. And so we have good data to show that it's good foreign policy to ensure that women are part of what we're doing. In the United States, I would point out that almost 20% of our active duty military are women. We have a recruitment challenge in our military. The only branch of the military that's meeting its recruitment goals are the Marines. And so the role of women in our military is very important. We're seeing this, I alluded to what's happening in Ukraine. It's very important. And our combatant commands, so we have the world divided into different military combatant commands. They are making very good use of women advisors to work with them on how to better engage with local populations. And so it makes a huge difference. That's part of what WPS is all about. And NATO has adopted the strategy. We passed the legislation back in 2017, so it's been supported by both Republican and Democratic leaders in the United States, and NATO has been adopting this strategy for the last several years. They've had somebody in charge of this at NATO who's done an excellent job, and that was the proposal that was presented. One of the things we talked about at that event on WPS was one of the goals right now for Ukraine is to help make sure that uniforms, that helmets, that all of the aspects of military combat are, that there is a design that helps ensure that the uniforms for women fit women and not just men. This has been an issue in our military as well. So they have an initiative that has been contributed to by a number of NATO nations to develop uniforms and other safety equipment for women combatants to ensure that it's designed for women so they can do a better job.
That's great. It's always amazing to think about the things you never think about until you need to think about them. So thank you for your insights. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Of course, we want to bring in the audience here. We do have a number of questions that have been emailed or put in the YouTube chat. So if you are watching online live, please do keep sending us your questions. So Ambassador Sweat, if you want to wait for the microphone, if you could introduce yourself so that we know who you are, and we only have about 15 more minutes, so keeping questions short and to the point is encouraged.
And easy. Only give me the easy questions.
First of all,
you know what?
Should be.
Let me turn this off.
The green light on it?
light is
Okay,
on.
it should. All right, there we go.
Here we go. Okay.
All right.
Well, first of all, I apologize for my late arrival. It was unintentional, and I didn't mean to walk in the middle of things.
Oh, no, sorry. Larry's just in the camera view.
I don't know. I'm getting
Behind
some
you,
feedback.
Larry. Yeah.
Two things about NATO that I'm curious if you could update me on. When I was ambassador over in Denmark, first of all, I was very pleased and proud to say that the Danes were the only country in NATO that had met their payment requirement at that time. Now it sounds like we're a quarter of the way to accomplishing that. You may have more than that. Okay, well that's great to hear. And my question in that regard, you may have answered before I arrived, but if we are not going to threaten not to provide support for them if they are attacked because they aren't at that level, how do we forcefully negotiate with them to get them to meet that requirement? And that's the first question. The second question has to do with... Okay, oh, I'm back. The second question has to do with when I was visiting all the NATO installations back in 2000, which was of course 24 years ago, there was always this conflict between NATO and the French NATO. And the French clearly had their own facilities, they had their own approach, they had their own blue berets. The whole thing was, in my mind, absurd, but it was an appeasement to them to keep them happy so that they would work more cooperatively within the whole group. Is that still the case, or are we resolving issues like that, similar to what you were talking about with Turkey and Hungary, for example? Thank you.
Well, France is one of those countries in the past that hasn't always been on the same page with all the other NATO countries. I think that has mostly been resolved now. And as we know, there were elections in France, which means that they're very focused on some other challenges that they have right now. But President Macron was here this week, and I think France has been a very important contributor to Ukraine and continues to be very committed to that. Tell me your first, how do we? Yeah, you know, because NATO is a consensus organization, NATO would have to vote to sanction its own members if they didn't reach the 2%. I think what they have determined today is that it's much better to provide peer pressure from countries and to point out the benefits of getting to the 2%, and they've been very successful. And I would say the Secretary General Stoltenberg has been really impressive in his 10 years at NATO. One of the best moments this week at the summit was when President Biden gave the Medal of Freedom to Secretary General Stoltenberg. He certainly deserves that. He's done a masterful job, and I'm looking forward to his successor having that role model to build on.
I served with his father at the Embassy Road in Copenhagen past 2000.
Yeah, it's been impressive. The new Secretary General is Mark Rutte from the Netherlands, and he has had a lot of experience in coalition governments, so I hope that will serve him well as he takes over the job.
All right, Brian, sorry, you have a question.
Thank you for joining us, Senator. My name is Ryan, and my question is, Prime Minister Starmer recently announced that the UK was lifting the ban on using Storm Shadow missiles over the border in Russia. And I think this is a pattern that we've seen of an overly cautious approach in which later, through pressure, we relent on that and then allow it. In your personal view, at what point does rightful caution about fear of unintended escalation turn to portraying weakness? And given the need that you said that we need to send, the democracies of the world need to send a strong and clear message.
Well, I have been in favor since the invasion of Crimea in providing lethal weapons to Ukraine, in helping them have what they need to defend themselves. So I don't always agree with the policy that we should limit their ability to use longer range weapons that can go into Russia. I understand the policy because of the concern about escalation of the war. But one of the things that the Secretary General said this week, when I asked the question, we had Germany, Chancellor Scholz, we had the new Prime Minister Starmer from Great Britain, and we had Secretary General Stoltenberg there, and I asked them about how do we keep, in a democracy, how do we keep our publics supportive of the effort to support Ukraine in this war? And one of the things the Secretary General said that really resonated with me, he said, the sooner we can end this war, the better. And the more support we give to Ukraine, the sooner we're going to end this war. And so that's how I feel about the longer range weapons. The sooner they're able to use those weapons, and I don't have any concern that they will do what Russia did and attack civilian targets in a children's hospital in Russia. I think the Ukrainians are professional and they will not do that. But the sooner we do that, the sooner we end this war, and the more likely that they are going to be successful.
And just to follow up on that a bit, I think there's a broader conversation around slow playing a lot of the decisions that we eventually get to, and how that has sort of hamstrung, whether it's tanks, whether it's the ATACMS or various systems, putting limitations on that. So where do we fall as a country and as a NATO alliance on the idea that if Putin rattles his nuclear saber, we seem to say, okay, we won't do it, but then 6 months later we do it. Can you give a little bit of insight into your feelings around whether or not we should be, should we be concerned about Russian escalation, or should we be making them concerned about our escalation? Where do we fall kind of in between all of that?
Well, I think we should be concerned about both, frankly. And as we know, Russia has nuclear weapons. Every time Putin feels threatened. He sort of rattles the saber of nuclear weapons. I think he also understands, however, that he does not want to get involved in a nuclear war because he will not win that. But that would not be in anyone's interest. But again, I go back to that's why the more successful the Ukrainians are, the sooner we end this war, the better for everybody. One of the challenges that the war in Ukraine has reminded us of and made us realize is that we're not as well prepared to address our own security as we thought we were. And so this has been a real wake-up call. And one of the issues with some of the weapons has just been the capacity to get them those weapons. But in that respect, it's been important. It's been important not just for the United States, but for other NATO countries to see that our defense industrial base needs some work, and that we've got to do a better job of ensuring that they have the long-range support that they need to be able to produce what we need to ensure deterrence and security at home, and so that we are prepared if we are engaged in a future war.
Yeah, well, Grace, we'll go to you first. Right behind you, like, right there.
Hi, Senator Grace Preston from GSSI. I think you remember me from last year testifying. So I know NATO is really concerned to obviously focus with Russia and China, but I'd like to kind of understand what the feeling is with Iran. And I know, the NATO countries could get pulled into a greater conflict in the Middle East. And, I know Iran is kind of working to kind of undermine stability there. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on that and maybe any discussions that you heard last week. Thank you.
I wasn't engaged in many discussions around what's happening in Iran, except to the extent that they are part of this new relationship between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea that seems to be developing, and the threat that that presents. Now, as you know, Iran just had elections. The more moderate, in quotes, candidate won those elections and talked about his interest in trying to, I don't think he used the word normalize, but to improve relations with Europe and with the rest of the world. So that remains to be seen, what happens there. In the meantime, they have been one of the biggest providers of drones for Russia for the war in Ukraine. We've seen their support across the Middle East for Hamas, for Hezbollah, for the Houthis, and the threat that that poses in the Red Sea and to commerce on the oceans. So there's no doubt that they have been a negative force, and they have not directly threatened NATO countries that I'm aware of. So I think it's an area that we need to watch very carefully.
Okay, Rob?
Thanks. Rob Warner, League of Conservation Voters, World Affairs Council member. There's a lot of disinformation, a great deal of disinformation about Europe's contribution to the defense of Ukraine. We have folks in this country, in the political realm, that are saying, oh, they're not just doing anything, they're not doing as much as we're doing. And that's just not true. So how is it that we can really push against that to really correct the record on that? Because it's important to do so.
You're absolutely right. There is a misperception that it's only the United States that's providing support for Ukraine. And if you add up the humanitarian assistance that is coming from Europe for Ukraine, they've provided more support for Ukraine than we have. And it's a message that we need to keep repeating and get out so that Americans understand that this is a real united allied effort to support Ukraine. And it was a part of the conversation that we had with some of the leaders, because it has an impact not just with the public here in the United States, but also in Congress. There are a number of people in Congress who don't realize the extent to which Europe has stepped up. And so it's a message we need to continue to promote.
All right, Jim, and then Jeff, and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Hi, Senator Jim Townsend from Manchester. Happy you're here. We're not going to win the war in Ukraine because we're going to run out of Ukrainian foot soldiers, whereas it seems that Russia has an unlimited supply of despots from all over places that they can shell out hundreds of thousands of forced military people. That's what concerns me. What can be done about that?
That is a concern, obviously. I was talking to someone this week about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and they were pointing out to me that the Russians lost about 15,000 people in Afghanistan, and there was so much opposition in the country that was one of the reasons they pulled out of Afghanistan. We are dealing with a very different Russia today. There is very little sharing of information. One of the things that Russia has allowed as the result of this war that they didn't during Afghanistan is a lot of the people who opposed the war have left Russia. They've gone, they've been able to get out. And so a lot of the dissidents who might be there causing problems are not there. And so many of the Russians who have been recruited into the army, I use the word recruitment loosely, are from very poor, very rural parts of the country. They're not from the cities there. And Russia has been losing about 30,000 people a month. So how long they can keep that up, I think, remains to be seen. But there's no doubt that Ukraine can't lose people at that rate. They've lowered their age limit for recruitment into the military in Ukraine. But the thing that has made the biggest difference in this war to date has been the willingness to fight. And I think for all of us who watched the start of the war, when the news reports were that Kyiv was going to be overrun within the week, to see what the Ukrainians have done and continue to do is so amazing when you think about the courage and the unity that they have shown. And as they've said, President Zelensky has said, we're not just fighting for Ukraine, we're fighting for democracies all over the world. I had a chance to, some of you may have heard me tell this story, but I had a chance about a year into the war to meet with a number of women in the Ukrainian military. And I can remember the conversation so clearly because they were making the plea that we needed to provide more weapons and longer range weapons and F-16s. And she said, you need to give us the weapons so that we can fight the Russians so you don't have to. And that, to me, sort of says it all about what they've been willing to do. So I hope we will continue to support them, and it's important, I think, for all of us to talk about why this is in our own interest.
Jeff.
Thank you very much for speaking with us today. This is wonderful. My name is Jeff Spears. I live in Raymond, New Hampshire. My question deals with another aspect of warfare I don't hear talked about as much, and that's dealing with alliances. I mean, we've talked about alliances here, and I think watching the conduct of particularly Russia and to a lesser extent China, Putin has done two things very well. From my perspective, is he's disrupted not just our alliances, but alliances important to our NATO allies, such as France. And he's done a good job of building alliances, such as this axis with North Korea and Iran and so forth. So my question is, are we looking at how to disrupt his alliances? Can we disrupt that alliance between Russia and China? We've been looking at that through NATO. And what can we do to counter some of his effective disruption, for instance, throughout all of Africa, of former relations with the French government? Thank you.
Well, I would argue that we've been a lot more successful than Putin at working with our allies, and that one of the real strategic mistakes that Vladimir Putin made was the war in Ukraine. Because what it did was to bring NATO together in ways that we hadn't been, and with the exception of one or two countries, really build support for Ukraine in ways that have supported them in their fight against Russia. Now, sadly, one of the debates we have in Congress is about the fact that building our allies isn't just about the military. It's also about our diplomacy. And what we have seen over the last couple of decades is that China, in particular, more so than Russia, has a clear proposal. Their Belt and Road Initiative is all about going into countries all over the world. They've focused on Africa. They've even gone into Europe and in South America, and provided assistance, loans, grants. They've brought in their workers, and they've taken over ports and other infrastructure projects in parts of the world in ways that have been challenging for us, because one of the things that's happening right now in Congress has been, because of the partisanship, a real obstacle to getting our diplomats approved. I don't care whether you like Joe Biden or Donald Trump. It's in America's interest to ensure that we have ambassadors in every country in the world. And right now, we don't. For a long time, a number of the countries that were NATO allies didn't have ambassadors. In Africa, we had 9 of the most populous countries in Africa, including Nigeria, including the African Union, that did not have ambassadors. And we've got to help reverse that, because as you say, it's about building our alliances. It's about working with folks. One of the real challenges we had immediately after the war in Ukraine was the fact that Russia stopped all of the grain shipments out of Ukraine. And what we suddenly discovered was, the Black Sea is really important, because all the grain that comes to feed Africa and countries around the world is coming right through the Black Sea. And so helping remind people that this is not a partisan issue. This should be an issue about what's in the best interest of America. And we really need to have people express that view, so that it's not all about partisanship, but it's about how do we improve our diplomacy, how do we promote that around the world, because right now we're not doing the job we need to do.
Thank you. And I totally appreciate that. It's something we've been looking at and talking about for a number of years, because this is a long-term issue. But I just want to key in real quick on the alliance disruption idea. We heard President Biden last night talk about how China should not be able to benefit from their support for Russia. We heard Secretary General Stoltenberg talk about, NATO is a defensive alliance, not an economic one, but countries are going to be looking at their economic relationships with China because of their relationship to Russia. Obviously a lot to unpack there, but anything you can share around path forward on what we might be seeing coming out of NATO countries, even if it's not necessarily NATO's purview.
Well, as we talked earlier about the very strong statement about China being an enabler, I think sent a message to China, and China responded to that. They were not happy about being called out in that way. In terms of sanctions, individual countries will have to decide that on their own. But I think one of the really important things about the statement about the increased focus on what China is doing is to wake up some of our allies about the threat that China poses. Again, when I was in the Indo-Pacific, one of the things we heard from President Marcos in the Philippines, we heard it from the communist leadership in Vietnam, we heard it, of course, from Korea and Japan, was China's incursion into the South China Sea, their incursion into territorial waters of those countries that they viewed as a threat, the potential for China to go into Taiwan and what that meant. In Japan, they pointed out how close they are to Taiwan. In Japan, we've seen Japan, as the result of that, doubled their defense budget, and for a country that has not really had a defense since World War II, that's impressive that they're seeing the threat and the recognition that what China is doing poses a threat to other countries in the Indo-Pacific. And we also heard that China's not happy. China sees that they were not happy with our agreement with the United Kingdom and Australia on the submarine deal called AUKUS, because they saw that as threatening to China, and they're not happy with the fact that we're seeing countries in the Indo-Pacific really raise the same concerns about China and their potential to shut down commerce in the South China Sea and other parts of the Pacific, their potential to have an impact on what happens in those countries in the region. So it's one of the places where I think I came back from that trip feeling like we had a strategy in the Indo-Pacific, we were executing on that strategy, and we were being successful in a way that was important for our future.
Well, thank you so much. I know we're a little bit past time, but I always like to leave a final opportunity for anything you think we might have missed or any important last words you'd like to leave the audience with.
Yeah, I actually, yesterday, Jim Risch, who is the ranking member from Idaho, Republican from Idaho, and I were talking to some folks who were doing some research on NATO. And they were asking us, how do you convince people that supporting the war in Ukraine and supporting NATO is important? And he talked about how in Idaho, he has a real challenge in convincing his constituents about why this is important. And I said, I actually don't feel that way. In New Hampshire, it feels like we've had a lot of grassroots support for Ukraine. We've got a number of organizations in the state that have worked to provide assistance to Ukraine. Whenever I go places, this is not an issue that people say they're concerned about. In fact, they talk about, as you all have, about why this is important to the United States and to us in New Hampshire. So I just want to thank all of you for your interest, for being here, for your continued efforts, because that's really important as we think about how do we sustain support for NATO, how do we sustain support for Ukraine. It's the grassroots, it's folks talking to neighbors and friends and co-workers about why this is in our interest. So thank you all very much, and thank you to the World Affairs Council for your support as well.
Yeah, of course, we always really appreciate having the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time here today. And thank you to everyone for joining us, whether in person, online, or watching the recording. We've talked a lot about Ukraine. Anise will be very happy that I'll highlight for you all that on August 1st through 4th, we'll have a group of members of parliament from Ukraine here in New Hampshire. There will be a couple of opportunities for you to meet with them, so please, if you're not already on our mailing list, on our email list, sign up, talk to us here in person, and we'll let you know those details as we confirm them. So thank you very much to everyone for joining. Thank you so much, Senator, for your insights. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I have 300 more questions I could ask you, but I'll summarize them in an email for you. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great day.